Women can't code. They just don't have the logical mindset for it. Stick to making coffee and looking pretty. Those were the exact words my boss, Richard Blackwood, said to me on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m., right before he handed me my termination letter. My name is Sarah Mitchell, I'm 29 years old, and I was a senior software engineer at Blackwood Technologies in Austin, Texas. As I sat there in that sterile conference room, watching this arrogant man in his expensive suit destroy my career with a smirk, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked out with my dignity intact. What Richard didn't know was that his words had just sealed his fate. For 3 years at Blackwood Technologies, I had been the ghost in the machine. While Richard took credit for my algorithms and innovations, I had quietly documented everything. Every late-night debugging session, every breakthrough in our flagship product, every piece of code that made the company profitable. I had proof it was mine. But more importantly, during those countless overtime hours in the office, I had stumbled across files I probably wasn't supposed to see. Financial discrepancies, suspicious transactions, invoices for services never rendered. I had kept meticulous notes, not for revenge, but because my analytical mind couldn't ignore patterns that didn't add up. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who claimed women couldn't think logically had just made the most illogical decision of his life. Let me take you back to how this all started. 3 years earlier, I had graduated summa cum laude from UT Austin with a master's in computer science. Richard had personally recruited me from campus, impressed by my thesis on machine learning optimization. "You're exactly what we need," he had said then, his charm turned up to 11. "Fresh ideas, innovative thinking. You're going to revolutionize how we approach data processing." For the first year, everything seemed perfect. I worked 60-hour weeks gladly, thinking I was building something meaningful. My neural network implementation increased processing speed by 340%, and my compression algorithm saved the company an estimated $2.3 million annually in server costs. I lived and breathed code, staying until midnight to perfect systems that Richard would present to clients the next morning as his own innovations. The warning signs were subtle at first. My name gradually disappeared from project documentation. In meetings, Richard would present my solutions as collaborative efforts, then later as his own insights. When I tried to speak up during presentations, he would interrupt with phrases like, "What Sarah means to say is," or "building on that basic concept." I told myself it was just corporate politics, that my work would speak for itself eventually. I was brilliant at code, but naive about office dynamics. The breaking point came when TechCorp, a Fortune 500 company, offered to buy our flagship software for $15 million. The software that was 85% my code, built on my algorithms, optimized by my innovations. During the celebration, dinner, Richard stood up and gave a speech about his vision and technical expertise making the deal possible. He didn't mention my name once. When I approached him privately the next day to discuss recognition, he laughed. "Sarah, you're a good programmer, but let's be honest. You executed my vision. Don't confuse following instructions with innovation." That night, I made copies of everything. Every email where I had outlined solutions later claimed by Richard. Every piece of our commented code clearly attributed to me. Every timestamp showing when I had submitted breakthrough innovations. I told myself it was just for my portfolio, but deep down, I knew I was preparing for war. The final insult came 6 months later when I was passed over for promotion in favor of Jake Morrison, a recent hire with half my experience but twice my confidence in taking credit for collaborative work. When I requested a meeting with Richard to discuss my career trajectory, he scheduled it for the same morning he had apparently already decided to fire me. "The truth is, Sarah, you've hit your ceiling here. Programming is becoming more complex, more strategic. It requires a certain type of analytical thinking that, frankly, women just don't possess. You're better off finding something more suitable for your skill set." As I cleaned out my desk, my colleagues avoided eye contact. They knew what had happened was wrong, but corporate politics kept them silent. Only Maria Gonzalez, the HR director, pulled me aside. "Document everything," she whispered. "This isn't over." She was more right than she knew. Within 2 weeks, I had landed a position at Innovate Tech, Blackwood's biggest competitor. My interview consisted of a live coding session where I rebuilt their entire authentication system in real time, making it 60% more efficient. The CEO, David Chen, hired me on the spot with a 40% salary increase and a promise, "Here, your code speaks for itself." At Innovate Tech, I flourished. Without someone stealing my ideas, my productivity skyrocketed. I developed a revolutionary data encryption method that caught the attention of several major clients. More importantly, I began working on something personal, a comprehensive analysis of corporate financial irregularities that I had observed at my previous job. What had started as casual observation had evolved into a detailed investigation. You see, during my time at Blackwood Technologies, my desk had been positioned perfectly to observe Richard's office. His assistant often printed financial documents that she would leave on the shared printer. My pattern recognition skills, honed by years of debugging code, couldn't help but notice anomalies. Invoices from consulting companies that didn't seem to exist. Payments to contractors for services never rendered. Most interesting of all, a series of transfers to offshore accounts that coincided with major client payments. I had screenshots, printed documents, and a detailed timeline. Not because I was planning anything, but because inconsistencies bothered me the same way bugs in code did. They needed to be identified and cataloged. 2.5 years into my new career, I received an application that made me smile for the first time in months. The name at the top read, Emma Blackwood, computer science graduate from Stanford, seeking a junior developer position. Richard's daughter, the one he posted about constantly on LinkedIn, celebrating her achievements in the field he claimed women couldn't master. I interviewed her personally. Emma was brilliant. Her code was clean, efficient, and innovative. She had her father's confidence, but none of his arrogance. During our conversation, she mentioned her frustration with her father's old-school views about women in tech. "He keeps telling me I should consider project management instead of development," she laughed. "Can you believe that?" As if organizing people is somehow more natural for me than solving logical problems. I hired her immediately. Emma thrived in our environment. She was eager, talented, and hungry to prove herself. We often worked late together, and she would share stories about growing up with a father who never quite seemed to respect her chosen field. It was during one of these late-night conversations that she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The weird thing about my dad is how he's always stressed about money, but then suddenly he'll be flush with cash. Last month he was complaining about business being slow. Then 3 days later he bought a Porsche. When I asked about it, he just said business was complicated and I wouldn't understand. I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. That does sound strange for a business owner. Yeah, and he's always getting mail from places like the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. He says, "It's just international business correspondence. But what kind of software consulting requires Swiss bank letters?" Emma had just handed me the final pieces of a puzzle I had been unconsciously solving for 3 years. That night, I pulled out my old files and compared them with Emma's casual observations. The timeline aligned perfectly. The mysterious consulting payments corresponded with Richard's periods of sudden wealth. The offshore transfers happened right before his expensive purchases. Emma had unknowingly confirmed that my suspicions about financial irregularities weren't just paranoia. They were a systematic pattern of fraud. But I didn't tell Emma any of this. She was innocent in her father's schemes, and I wouldn't use her as a weapon against him. However, her information had given me the motivation to take my evidence to the proper authorities. I spent the next 2 months organizing everything into a comprehensive report. 5 years of computer science training had taught me to be methodical and thorough. I cross-referenced every suspicious transaction with public business records. I verified the non-existence of several consulting companies Richard had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to. I traced the ownership of offshore accounts through public financial filings. The picture that emerged was staggering. Over the past 4 years, Richard had systematically embezzled approximately $3.7 million from Blackwood Technologies. He had created fake vendors, inflated contract prices, and funneled money through a network of shell companies to offshore accounts. The man who had fired me for supposedly lacking analytical skills had been running a financial scheme that any competent auditor should have caught, if anyone had been looking. Armed with 247 pages of evidence, I contacted the IRS fraud hotline. Agent Patricia Collins was assigned to my case, a 15-year veteran of financial crimes. Investigation, she reviewed my evidence with the thoroughness of someone who had seen every type of corporate fraud imaginable. "This is the most comprehensive fraud documentation I've seen from a civilian," she told me during our 3rd meeting. "You've basically done 80% of our investigation for us. How did you know to track all of this?" Pattern recognition, I replied. It's what I do for a living. Inconsistencies in systems, whether they're computer programs or financial records, create detectable patterns if you know what to look for. Agent Collins smiled. Remind me never to try to hide anything from a software engineer. The IRS moves slowly, but when they move with devastating precision. 6 months after I filed my report, Agent Collins called me with an update. We've confirmed everything in your report and found additional irregularities. We're initiating a full audit of Blackwood Technologies and freezing the associated offshore accounts. Mr. Blackwood is about to have a very bad day. The audit began on a Thursday morning. I know this because Emma came into work pale and shaken. Something's wrong with my dad's company, she said. There are federal agents in his office, and they've frozen all the business accounts. He called me crying, actually crying, saying his life was over. I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Emma. She was about to discover that her father wasn't the man she thought he was. But I felt no such sympathy for Richard. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, I told Emma gently. These things usually get sorted out. But I knew it wouldn't be sorted out. Agent Collins had been thorough. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard's financial crimes were about to become very public. The news broke 3 days later. Local tech CEO under investigation for $3.7 million embezzlement scheme was the headline in the Austin Business Journal. The article detailed how an anonymous tip had led to the discovery of a sophisticated financial fraud involving fake companies and offshore accounts. Blackwood Technologies' stock plummeted, and major clients began canceling contracts. Emma took a personal day when the news broke. When she returned, she was quiet and thoughtful. I keep thinking about all the things that make sense now, she said during our one-on-one meeting. The expensive cars, the mysterious mail, the way he always seemed to have money when the business was supposedly struggling. I feel stupid for not seeing it. You're not stupid, I told her. You trusted your father. That's not a character flaw. The worst part is thinking about all the employees who are going to lose their jobs because of his greed. People like you probably were before you moved to a better company. I almost told her the truth then. Almost explained that her father's crimes had been discovered because he had fired someone who had been quietly documenting his financial irregularities for 3 years. Almost revealed that his sexist dismissal of women's analytical abilities had led to his downfall by someone whose analytical skills had unraveled his entire scheme. But I didn't. Emma was dealing with enough without learning that she had unknowingly helped bring down her own father. The criminal charges came 2 weeks later. Richard was indicted on 23 counts of embezzlement, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The case was airtight. My documentation combined with the IRS investigation had created an unbreakable chain of evidence. I followed the trial through news reports and public records. Richard's defense strategy seemed to be claiming ignorance of financial details, which was particularly ironic given that he had fired me for supposedly lacking the analytical skills he now claimed he didn't possess. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had systematically stolen from his own company while maintaining a lifestyle of expensive cars and luxury vacations. They presented evidence of fake consulting companies, inflated contracts, and offshore accounts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution. The original theft plus penalties and interest. Blackwood Technologies filed for bankruptcy within a month of his sentencing. The company that had dismissed my contributions was liquidated to pay back the money its founder had stolen. Emma came into my office the day after sentencing. She had been quiet for weeks, processing the reality of her father's crimes and the collapse of his business. I've been thinking about what you said when you hired me, she began. About how here, my code speaks for itself. I didn't fully understand what you meant then. And now? Now I realize you. We're talking about more than just programming. You were talking about being judged on merit instead of preconceptions, about working somewhere that values competence over politics. I nodded, remembering my own journey to that understanding. I want you to know that watching you work, seeing how you've built your reputation based on pure skill and innovation, has taught me something important about the kind of professional I want to be. Emma paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I also want to apologize for my father. I know you probably never worked with him directly, but the kind of attitudes he had about women in tech, they're wrong and harmful. I'm sorry you've probably encountered that kind of thinking in your career. If only she knew how directly I had encountered her father's attitudes. The important thing, I told her, is that you don't let other people's limitations become your own. Your father was wrong about a lot of things, but that doesn't diminish your abilities or your future. 6 months later, I received an unexpected visitor at Innovate Tech. Agent Collins knocked on my office door with a smile and a bottle of champagne. Richard Blackwood reported to federal prison this morning, she announced. I wanted to personally thank you for your work on this case. Your evidence was so thorough that we were able to recover 94% of the stolen funds. What happens to the employees who lost their jobs when the company folded? The recovered funds will cover their unpaid wages and benefits. Several of them have already found new positions, including some here at Innovate Tech, I understand. It was true. I had personally recommended 3 former Blackwood Technologies employees for positions at our company. They were talented people who had been victims of their CEO's greed, and they deserved a chance to rebuild their careers. There's something else, Agent Collins continued. The IRS has a whistleblower reward program. Given the amount of fraud involved and the quality of your evidence, you're eligible for a substantial financial reward. I hadn't known about any reward program when I reported Richard's crimes. I had been motivated by justice, not money. How substantial? $847,000, the maximum allowed under the program. I stared at her for a moment, processing the number. It was more money than I had made in my entire career up to that point. What do I need to do to claim it? Just sign some paperwork. The check should arrive within 60 days. That evening, I sat in my apartment, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I had been fired by a man who claimed women couldn't think analytically. Today, those same analytical skills had not only built me a successful new career, but had also exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and earned me a reward larger than most people's yearly salaries. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money or the vindication. It was knowing that Richard's sexist assumptions had been his downfall. If he had valued my skills instead of dismissing them, if he had treated me with respect instead of contempt, I might never have been motivated to look closely at the suspicious patterns I had observed. His prejudice had literally caused him to create the circumstances of his own destruction. Emma continued to excel at Innovate Tech. She developed into one of our most talented developers, specializing in security protocols. She never learned about my history with her father, and I never told her. She didn't need that burden, and I didn't need her gratitude. Watching her succeed based on her own merits was satisfaction enough. A year after Richard's sentencing, I used part of my whistleblower reward to start my own company, Mitchell Analytics, specializing in financial fraud detection software. This irony wasn't lost on me that I was now making a living from the same pattern recognition skills that had brought down my former boss. My first major client was the Texas Attorney General's office, which wanted software to detect the type of fraud schemes Richard had used. The contract was worth $2.3 million over 3 years. This system is incredibly sophisticated, the AG's chief investigator told me during the presentation. How did you know to look for these specific patterns? Experience, I replied. I've seen how these schemes work from the inside. 5 years after that humiliating morning in Richard's conference room, I was testifying before a Senate subcommittee on corporate fraud, presenting my software as a model for detecting financial crimes. The same analytical skills that Richard had dismissed as inadequate for programming were now being held up as an example for federal law enforcement. During a break in testimony, I checked my phone and saw a news alert. Richard Blackwood had been denied early parole. The parole board had noted that he showed insufficient remorse for his crimes and continued to blame others for his situation. Some people never learn. That evening, I had dinner with Emma, who had been promoted to senior developer at Innovate Tech. She was excited about a new project involving machine learning applications for healthcare. I've been thinking about starting my own company eventually, she told me. Following your example, you've shown me that it's possible to build something meaningful based on pure technical merit. What kind of company? Healthcare analytics, using AI to detect early signs of diseases in medical imaging. I think I could make a real difference. I smiled, remembering my own dreams at her age. You should do it. The world needs more women willing to bet on their own abilities. Did you always know you wanted to start your own company? I considered the question. No. Actually, I originally just wanted to be the best programmer I could be working for someone else. But sometimes circumstances force you to discover capabilities you didn't know you had. What changed your mind? I worked for someone who didn't value what I brought to the table. It taught me that if you want your contributions to be properly recognized, sometimes you have to create an environment where that's possible. Emma nodded thoughtfully. It's funny how the worst experiences can sometimes lead to the best outcomes. She had no idea how accurate that observation was. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me from that humiliating conference room to where I was today. Richard's attempt to destroy my confidence had instead forced me to discover my own strength. His dismissal of my abilities had motivated me to prove him wrong in ways he could never have imagined. The man who claimed women couldn't code was now serving 8 years in federal prison, brought down by evidence collected and analyzed by the woman he had underestimated. His company had been liquidated, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom taken away, all because he had been too arrogant to recognize the competence of someone he dismissed as inherently inferior. Meanwhile, that same woman had built a successful company, earned nearly $1 million in whistleblower rewards, and was now helping law enforcement agencies across the country detect financial crimes. The skills he had deemed inadequate for programming had proven sophisticated enough to unravel complex financial frauds and earn recognition from federal lawmakers. But perhaps the most satisfying irony of all was Emma. Richard's daughter, the child he had tried to discourage from entering tech, had become everything he claimed women couldn't be. She was logical, analytical, innovative, and successful. She was living proof that her father's prejudices were not just wrong, but destructively stupid. Sometimes karma needs a little help from pattern recognition. I never told Emma the full story of my connection to her father's downfall. She deserved to build her own legacy, without being burdened by the knowledge of how justice had been served on her behalf. But I kept the termination letter Richard had given me on that Tuesday morning 3 years earlier. It was framed on my office wall, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as evidence of how profoundly wrong someone can be about another person's capabilities. Visitors to my office often asked about it. That's a termination letter, I would explain, from a boss who said I didn't have the analytical skills necessary for complex programming. What happened to him? He's serving 8 years in federal prison for financial crimes that I helped uncover using the same analytical skills he said I didn't possess. And his company? Bankrupted and liquidated. Turns out that when you dismiss competent people based on prejudice, you sometimes drive away the very people who could have helped you avoid catastrophic mistakes. The conversation usually ended with a moment of uncomfortable silence as my visitors processed the implications. Richard Blackwood had thought he was firing an expendable employee whose gender made her inherently unsuited for analytical work. Instead, he had created an enemy with the skills, motivation, and opportunity to destroy everything he had built through his crimes. He had been wrong about women's ability to code. He had been even more wrong about their ability to pursue justice. The last I heard, Richard was working in the prison library, teaching basic computer literacy to other inmates. The irony of him having to acknowledge that he needed help with technology, from instructors who included several women, was not lost on me. Meanwhile, Mitchell Analytics continued to grow. We had identified and helped prosecute $47 million in corporate fraud across 12 different cases. The software I had developed was now being used by law enforcement agencies in 15 states. Emma had left Innovate Tech to start her own healthcare analytics company, securing $2.8 million in venture funding for her AI diagnostic software. Her success had been featured in several tech publications, with headlines like Stanford Graduates Revolutionary Healthcare AI and Young Say, Entrepreneur Disrupts Medical Diagnostics. None of the articles mentioned that she was the daughter of a convicted embezzler who had claimed women couldn't handle analytical thinking. That was probably for the best, but I kept copies of those articles in my desk drawer, next to Richard's termination letter. They served as perfect bookends to a story about the consequences of underestimating people based on prejudice, rather than evaluating them based on capability. 3 years and 8 months after Richard Blackwood told me that women couldn't code, I received a letter forwarded through my lawyer. It was from Richard, written from federal prison. The letter was brief. Ms. Mitchell, I have learned about your success in the technology industry and your work with law enforcement agencies. I wanted to reach out to acknowledge that my previous statements about women's capabilities in programming were incorrect and inappropriate. I hope you can find it in yourself to forgive my short-sighted comments. I also wanted to express my gratitude for the mentorship you have provided to my daughter Emma. Her success in launching her own company has been one of the few bright spots in a very difficult period for my family. If you are ever willing to speak with me about your career path and the work you have done in fraud detection, I would be grateful for the opportunity to learn from your expertise. Respectfully, Richard Blackwood. I read the letter 3 times, then filed it away without responding. Some apologies come too late to matter. Some recognition arrives only after the damage has been done. Richard's acknowledgement of my abilities was meaningless now, not because I held a grudge, but because it was motivated by desperation rather than genuine understanding. He wasn't reaching out because he had genuinely learned to respect women's capabilities. He was reaching out because his situation had forced him to confront the reality that the woman he had dismissed was now successful while he had lost everything. That wasn't growth. That was just consequences. Besides, I had already received all the validation I needed. It had come in the form of successful businesses, satisfied clients, and a daughter who had exceeded every limitation her father had tried to place on her gender. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't destroying your enemies. It was becoming so successful that their opinions of you became irrelevant. Richard Blackwood had tried to end my career by claiming women couldn't code. Instead, he had motivated me to become so good at coding, and at pattern recognition, and at building businesses, and at detecting fraud, that his entire world had collapsed while mine had flourished. That was justice. And justice, I had discovered, was far more satisfying than revenge. Sometimes the people who try to limit you end up proving just how unlimited you really are. The key is turning their dismissal into your motivation, their prejudice into your fuel, and their underestimation into your greatest advantage. Code, like justice, is logical. It follows rules, produces predictable outcomes, and eventually reveals the truth about everything it touches. Richard Blackwood learned this lesson 8 years too late.